So I'd like to welcome each and every one of you this evening. And on behalf of myself, Bob Ives, and on behalf of the Old Bristol Historical Society, I'd like to not only thank you for coming, but thank you for coming to this very special program. Sadly, it's the last summer lecture that we'll be having this summer, but we're very honored to have with us Jim Nelson. So Jim was born and raised in a town called Lewiston, Maine. Jim's father was a professor of English at Bates College, which is in Lewiston, of course. And his mother was an English teacher at Lewiston High School. So Jim was destined to be an author and a writer. In any event, he was raised in Lewiston, went to Lewiston High School, but at the ripe old age of 7, he suddenly developed this interest in maritime activity and began building ship's models and all very different schooners. Then at the age of 14 and 15, he built, again, a skipjack, the real deal, real boats, and went sailing in this lovely skipjack. Then he also, in high school, built a wonderful 18-foot canoe. It was not a big challenge, but the real challenge was getting it out of the cellar in which he had built it. No way to get it out. In any event, he goes on to Lewiston High School. After he graduated, he traveled around the United States. Firstly by hitchhiking, and secondly by motorcycle. After that journey around the United States, he then entered college. He went to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. After 2 years, he transferred to UCLA, to their School of Television and Films. And after he graduated from there, he went into television for 3 years. But then he developed this wanderlust to go on to the sea. And he decided he would go on board the replica of Sir Francis Drake's Golden Hind. He spent 2 years there as a bosun, as a bosun's mate, but then he suddenly met a lovely lady there, a woman named Lisa Page, who we're very grateful that she's still here, and they were wed a number of years ago. After Jim was on the Golden Hind, he just transferred over to another boat, to the HMS Rose, where he developed another passion, a passion for writing about maritime history. And indeed, it is where he began his first novel. And indeed, Jim has now since written 25 different novels on maritime history. He is the winner of the American Library Association and the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award. He has lectured all over the country and appeared on the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, National Geographic, and Book TV. He is currently living in Harpswell with Lisa, and they have 4 children. Also, I might mention that Jim was the head rigger and in charge of sales for the vessel launched in last year in Bath, the Virginia, Maine's first ship. So without further ado, would you join with me now in giving a warm round?
Well, thank you for that introduction. I don't know who that guy is, but he sounds insufferable. Thank you so much for turning out. This is terrific. It's always, hard on a beautiful summer evening to get folks to show up for stuff. So I appreciate that. And now I wish I'd thought of something to say. So ignore this, by the way. This is they give me this in lieu of the ankle bracelet as part of my work release. So this. Now, what I want to talk about tonight is Maine's most notorious pirate, Dixie Bull, well known in this area. Now, to be honest, being Maine's most notorious pirate is kind of like being the most sincere politician in Washington or being the most dedicated vegetarian in Wyoming. It's an interesting distinction, but there's not a lot of competition. And, at the risk of offending any locals, I have to say that Dixie Bull actually was not really much of a pirate. And there wasn't actually a lot of piracy going on in New England. So what I'd like to do first is kind of take a step back historically and look at the trends in piracy at this period, the late 1500s, early 1600s, and sort of look at where the real action pirate-wise was going on, and discuss from there why Maine really was not a place that was very attractive to these folks. So to take a big step back, we all know the history. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, ran into a continent that he did not know was there, luckily for him. If he hadn't, I always tell kids that, you know, if America had not been here, instead of celebrating Columbus Day, we would celebrate Dead Guy in the Middle of the Ocean Day, because he would not have made it. So Columbus lands, very quickly discovers the one thing that was most sought after by anybody coming over from Europe to the New World. And that, of course, is silver and gold. Great abundances of precious metals in the New World. Once this discovery is made, it's like the floodgates open. And you get this unbelievable exodus from Spain almost entirely into the Caribbean area and what would become the Spanish Main. It's just extraordinary how fast this goes from a recently discovered area to just a thriving colony of Spain. So you have, you know, following behind Columbus, you have the conquistadors, and then of course you have the government officials who are there to set up the local government. You have the church coming in and establishing itself. You have all of these, you know, the workers, the sailors, the soldiers, all these people pouring into the New World. Spain considered this part of the New World, the Spanish Main and the Caribbean area, they considered it a Spanish lake. It was exclusively Spanish territory. They wanted no interlopers, and they tried very hard to keep everybody out. But that's a lot of territory. And Spain didn't have anything like the military or naval power that was required to really keep the interlopers out. And of course, very soon after Spain moves in, you have these massive quantities of gold that are pouring into all of these major cities all over the area. Veracruz and Maracaibo and Panama. And you also have these huge galleons moving around the Caribbean loaded with gold and silver. There's no way the rest of the world is going to ignore this. And so, of course, they immediately start, as soon as Spain starts establishing itself, the other countries start sort of moving in as best they can. In the early to mid-1500s, you have the French primarily poking around, making incursions into some of the islands further to the west, the Leeward and Windward Islands. And then by the later 1500s, you see the rise of these notorious pirates, the English sea dogs. And these are just three of the most famous of them. It's Sir John Hawkins, Sir Francis Drake, and Sir Thomas Cavendish. And you notice something similar in all their names. They all have that word sir in front of their names. Now, these are folks that the Spanish absolutely considered pirates, but the British, or the English, of course, did not. Even though what they were doing was clearly illegal, for most of their careers, England and Spain were not actually at war. But the English crown was happy to sort of give a wink and a nod to their activities and happy to take their cut of whatever plunder these guys took from the Spanish. So you have this sort of quasi-legal, quasi-nationalist element to the piracy that was going on at this point. Now, about this time, again, around early 1600s, the island of Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, that was the seat of Spanish colonial rule. And Santo Domingo, which is in the southern shore, was the capital of colonial Spain in the New World. So it was a very important place in terms of Spanish rule. There was also on the island, as it happens, a great abundance of feral pigs and cattle that the Spanish had brought over and released on the island, and also which had been, escaped from the many plantations that were there. And they're running all over the wild, breeding like crazy. So these cattle and pigs attracted a group of hunters who settled mostly on the northwestern coast of Hispaniola. And they made their careers out of hunting the pigs and cattle and smoking the meat. And these are like really wild guys. They're kind of analogous to the mountain men of the Old West in America. They're really kind of savage, pretty much as feral as the cattle that they're hunting there. And they've got their long muskets and their hunting dogs. And they were hunting this cattle, and they were smoking them on these frameworks that you can see in the picture there called boucans. And these fellows came to be known as the Buccaneers, when they ended up being, of course, the Buccaneers. And they were living on the north shore of Haiti, smoking the meat, trading it with passing ships, selling it to the plantations. In the off season, they were doing a little raiding, a little piracy. It's a living. But they really weren't a huge problem to Spain. They were a nuisance, but they weren't really an existential threat in any capacity. But again, Spain would not tolerate any incursions in the New World. And they would not tolerate these buccaneers living on the north shore of Hispaniola. So they made a concerted effort to drive them out. They slaughtered the cattle that was running wild on the island to deprive them of their game. They started harassing them and pushing them out until finally the Buccaneers abandoned Hispaniola and moved to the island of Tortuga, which is just off the northwest coast of Hispaniola or Haiti. And this is a classic example of the law of unintended consequences. Because here you had these guys who were kind of a nuisance, but not really a big problem. But now suddenly, they've got no way to make a living. And they really, really hate the Spanish. So they become essentially a mercenary army looting the Spanish. They go from occasional piracy to like big-time serious piracy and become a real threat to Spain. And of course, these are not guys that you want to have as your enemies. These are tough, they're excellent shots, they've got nothing to lose, they really, really are motivated. So the Buccaneers become a genuine threat to Spain. They become, as I said, as they become more organized, they become sort of a mercenary army. And the English and the French realize that they can mobilize these guys against the Spanish. And as the Buccaneers grow, they go from Tortuga to Port Royal in Jamaica and settle in some of these other towns, which become essentially Buccaneer strongholds. And then as the 1600s go on, the Buccaneers really kind of have their ultimate expression in Henry Morgan. You may know him from rum fame, but he was in fact sort of considered the king of the Buccaneers. Henry Morgan could mobilize armies of literally hundreds of ships and thousands of buccaneers. And he would lead them in sacking all of these major Spanish cities, Veracruz and Maracaibo. He destroyed Panama City. He was a pretty vicious psychopath. In fact, his depredations were so awful that the English finally couldn't put up with it anymore. I mean, Spain was protesting so loudly that King Charles had Morgan arrested and brought back to England in chains. And by way of punishment, he knighted Morgan and made him lieutenant governor of Jamaica. That was his punishment. So again, you still see that sort of quasi-political aspect to the Buccaneers. Now, there are a couple of reasons that I wanted to talk about the Buccaneers. One, because in terms of piracy, this really was the first stage in a historical period that we think of as the golden age of piracy, the point where piracy really was at its most prevalent, most predominant in the Caribbean in particular. So this is, in terms of real piracy, this is where it was happening. The other reason I wanted to mention this is because, by sheer coincidence, one of my last novels is called The Buccaneer Coast, and is about the rise of the Buccaneers here. And so this is also a shameless plug for my book, which incidentally is for sale in the back of the room afterwards. So this is what's going on in the Caribbean at the time. Meanwhile, back in New England, throughout the late 1500s and into the early 1600s, you had essentially a who's who of explorers that came through this area. All of the big names showed up here. Verrazano came through here, Samuel de Champlain, Bartholomew Gosnold, George Weymouth, John Smith of Pocahontas fame. These guys all came through, charted the place, wrote about it, and then moved on. Nobody stayed. There wasn't really any reason for them necessarily to stay here. As I said, when the Spanish showed up in the Caribbean, they found gold. When these guys showed up in this area, they found something else that was enormously valuable. Cod! Unbelievable amounts of cod. And the fishing grounds had sort of been known for probably at least 100 years prior to this. And up in Newfoundland, you had French and Basque and other nationalities, other countries who were sending fishermen over and setting up these sort of temporary fishing camps where they would come over in the spring, they would fish all summer, salt down the fish, and then go back to their European countries in the winter. There was no reason to stay. There was nothing here that they couldn't get in Europe. There was, wasn't the motivation to settle like the Spanish had. As the explorers started coming through the Gulf of Maine, they realized that this was actually even more abundant in terms of fish and in terms of resources. I wanted to read you this little bit here from, this is, it's called Rosier's True Relation. It's one of the early accounts of explorers who had come through this area. And he writes, wherefore, our sails being down, Thomas King, boatswain, presently cast out a hook, and before he judged it at ground, was fished and hauled up an exceedingly great and well-fed cod. Then there were cast out 3 or more, and the fish was so plentiful and so great, as when our captain would have set sail, we all desired him to suffer them to take fish a while, because we were so delighted to see them catch so great fish, so fast as the hook came down. And you see accounts of this again and again in all of these early writings about this area. They cannot believe the abundance of fish that they're seeing here. Actually, I got to read you one more thing. I love this. It has nothing to do with cod, but I think this is very funny. This is from Robert Davies' journal, and he was with the Popham colony that came over in 1607. This is one of the best accounts we have of the Popham colony. And he talks about, so the boat went presently from the ship unto a point of an island, and there at low water in 1 hour killed 50 great lobsters. You shall see them where they lie in shoal water, not past a yard deep, and with a great hook made fast to a staff you shall hitch them up. They are great store of them, and you may near lade a ship with them. They are of great bigness. I have not seen the like in England. Isn't that great? So there's literally going out with a hook and just picking up these massive lobsters off the bottom. Wow, those are the old days. So, folks were coming over and they were fishing, but they weren't necessarily settling. And it's hard to really overemphasize the difference between what was going on in Spanish colonial Caribbean and the Maine and what was happening here in New England. It was just extraordinary. So this is Basilica Minor de Santa Maria. My wife will give me a hard time for my pronunciation. This is the cathedral in Santo Domingo in now the Dominican Republic. This was built in 1550. This is what they were building then. You know, it's almost 60 years later that you see the first attempt at an English colony here in Maine at Popham, and it looked like that. You know, and that didn't even last. I mean, it's just unbelievable, the infrastructure that the Spanish had created in the New World. You know, literally, by the time these guys are here, St. Augustine is up for urban renewal. It's just incredible. So you see, this is one of the reasons why there was no piracy in Maine. There was nothing to steal. And whenever I talk to kids about this, I say, you know, well, you know, we had fish. Would you rather steal gold or rather steal fish? Fish. No, gold. It's like, you've heard of the Pirates of the Caribbean? That's why they went to the Caribbean. There was gold there. But by the 1630s, you start to see kind of a change in attitude in England. A lot of the powers that be are starting to recognize that there is a lot to be said for this part of the world. And as Spain is clearly taking over their part of the world, and as France is taking over in Quebec and expanding their territories there, the English really start to realize, okay, we've got to do something here. For folks who aren't, how many folks are familiar with Popham Colony? I'm curious. Okay. You guys are more informed than most people. But for those who have not heard of it, this was, you got to get me back for another talk about this. This is great stuff. In 1607, of course, Jamestown was established in Virginia. What most people don't know, even most Mainers don't know, is that the idea was to establish a southern colony in Virginia and a northern colony in Maine. Then you sort of leave the middle territory unclaimed, and whichever colony is the more successful gets the middle colony. So this really was kind of a sister colony to Jamestown, only lasted about 14 months. But it's an example of how in England they were starting to realize, okay, we can't just ignore this part of the world. First off, if we want it, we've got to grab it now. And secondly, there are a lot of resources that are very, very valuable. You know, not only the fish, but of course, you know, England is being stripped of timber. So, you know, the woods were very attractive, the lumber that was available here. There was always the hope of gold. You know, every expedition, including Popham Colony, sent miners hoping that they would find gold, which needless to say they didn't. But there was this growing realization that it was time to start colonizing this part of the world. So, you know, by the late 1620s, Pemaquid is established as a colony. Boston is established. Of course, Plymouth was, you know, the Pilgrims were, you know, 10 years earlier in 1620. So you do start to see a more concerted effort on the part of England to start establishing colonies in this part of the world. And this is where Maine's most formidable pirate, Dixie Bull, comes into the picture. You didn't think I'd get around to him, did you? But here I am. Here's the only known photo of Dixie Bull. Actually, not only is that not Dixie Bull, despite my kind of fanciful outfit there, I'm about 35 years older than Dixie Bull was when he was operating. So Not the most realistic portrayal, but what am I going to do? So there are a few things that are interesting about Dixie. Of course, he is Maine's first pirate, sort of Maine's only real pirate, and not necessarily much of a pirate. Now, why do I say he wasn't much of a pirate? Well, he really did not fit the kind of standard mold of a pirate. Most pirates came to the ranks of sailors. Not surprising, that's where they did their work. Most pirates start out as either men-of-war's men on naval ships or privateers. Very often when a war ended and all these guys got thrown out of work, they just basically kept doing what they've been doing all along, except now it becomes piracy. In the Caribbean, a big percentage of those crews were escaped slaves. Piracy was probably the purest meritocracy, I think, in the New World, and certainly the closest thing to democracy. But anyway, that's another talk. So most of these guys were sailors. They were guys who came really from the very bottom rungs of society. Guys who were used to being treated very poorly, used to being kicked around. Sailors were not treated well at that time. These were guys who were willing to risk being hanged in exchange for real freedom. You know, these were guys who were done with being pushed around. A short life but a merry one was the pirates' creed. They were willing to risk it. They were willing to sort of, fly in the face of convention and live the lives that they wanted to live. Dixie Bull was not that. He did not come from those ranks. Dixie Bull was born in Huntingdonshire, England, eastern part of England, in the early 1600s. He was probably the second of three brothers. There's at least one sister that we know of, maybe more. Dixie's older brother, Seth, or Seath as it's spelled sometimes, was an apprentice, he apprenticed as a skinner to the Worshipful Company of Skinners of London. Now, the skinners were guys who worked in the fur trade mostly. And it sounds like, okay, well, that doesn't sound like a great job. But actually, it was a pretty prestigious position. The Worshipful Company of Skinners, that's their crest, was a very ancient guild. They were established by royal charter in 1327. They were one of 7 original guilds in London, and they were very, very well respected. So being part of the Society of Skinners was not something to sneeze at. It was, as they say, it was good work if you can get it. So Seth Bull was a skinner with the society. In 1627, Dixie Bull enters an apprenticeship under Seth as a skinner. So Dixie Bull, too, is becoming part of this society. It was an apprenticeship that lasted 9 years, which means that Dixie would have still been an apprentice when he was here raiding on the coast of Maine. And again, like I said, the real pirates were guys that came from the bottom rungs of society. But the Bull brothers were not at that bottom rung. They were solidly sort of yeoman class. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they weren't poor either. They were just sort of, what we might consider middle class today. So as I said, again, New England was increasingly being viewed as a place worthy of settlement, and a lot of folks were starting to establish colonies here. Boston, Pemaquid, all these different places were starting to be established by the late 1620s, early 1630s. And it seems that the Bull brothers also viewed this as a land of opportunity and had their sights set on it. They recognized that this is a place where someone could make a fortune, which was becoming increasingly difficult in England. This is a time where they were starting to enclose the commons so that, it was harder and harder for folks to to actually make a living, and it was forcing a lot of people into labor that they didn't necessarily want to do. But the New World offered some real opportunity. In fact, Dixie and Seth's names appear on a land patent along with a number of others for a large tract of land in what is now York, Maine. So they were already starting to speculate in land in this part of the world. And it also seems that they were engaged in arranging for apprentices to take passage to the New World. And they would sort of get a cut of this. This is another business that they're involved in. So again, you can see, far from being the dregs of society, the Bull brothers were actually, pretty ambitious entrepreneurs. They had their hands in a lot of different things. They were definitely focused on making their fortune. So by 1631, Dixie Bull has come over to New England, undoubtedly working with his brother. Dixie was probably the one who was sent over to start collecting furs and send them back, and Seth is the one back in London who's doing the selling and doing that arranging. We know that Dixie Bull was operating along the coast of Maine, trading with the Native Americans primarily for beaver pelts. Now, at that time, this part of the world, and particularly when you get out toward Penobscot Bay, was really kind of the frontier between England and France. And there was a lot of dispute over where the border was. There was a lot of fighting back and forth between the French and the English. And this is sort of the source of Dixie's troubles. Now, it's typical at the time that a trader, a local trader on the coast, would build some kind of a storehouse or a warehouse, usually fortified in some manner. A fellow named Abraham Schertz built a warehouse like that down in Pemaquid about 1630. Probably a stockade fence around it, and a wooden fort of some kind, nothing too elaborate. There was also one in Penobscot Bay, possibly in Castine. We know so little about this stuff. But we do know that there was a warehouse like this in Castine. And Dixie Bull had his trade goods and the furs that he had traded for in this storehouse. Whether Dixie was there at the time or not, it's not entirely clear. But a small French ship comes sailing into Penobscot Bay, and they drop anchor near this warehouse. And they come ashore, and they explain that they've just come from the sea. They don't know where they are. Their ship is leaking. Mon Dieu. It's, they just need some time to fix things up. And again, there's tension between the English and the French, but they're not actually at war. So the crew from this French ship goes ashore to this warehouse, and they're kind of checking it out, and they're realizing, okay, there's only about 3 or 4 guys here, and they don't seem to be really paying attention. They had, this is based on contemporaneous reports. Apparently, they had in the warehouse there were muskets mounted on the walls. And the Frenchmen start taking the muskets down and saying, hey, this is a nice gun. Are these loaded? No? Well, ours are. And so they basically took these guys in the warehouse by surprise and looted it, stole everything. Some accounts say that Dixie Bull's, so all of Dixie's stuff was in this warehouse, along with other people's. Some accounts say that Dixie Bull's boat was also stolen. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but some accounts suggest that. In any event, what happens is that Dixie Bull is wiped out. So he's here on the coast of Maine, no trade goods, no furs, no money, no way to get home. He's really stuck. So, what's the guy going to do? He got a force together and did, probably the most logical thing that he could do. He got about 15 men together, armed men in a boat, and he went out east looking for these French guys to get his stuff back. I mean, that would be the reasonable thing to do. So he spent weeks and weeks, apparently, cruising the coast of Maine, eating lobster rolls, we don't know, possibly, looking for these French pirates, and was never able to find them. So he's apparently becoming increasingly desperate. And the only thing he has left to do is to attack the people that he can find, the people who do have money. So he starts stopping ships on the high seas and looting them. In November 21st, Governor Winthrop in Massachusetts receives a letter saying, Dixie Bull and 15 more of the English who kept about the east were turned pirates and had taken diverse boats and rifled Pemaquid. So Dixie Bull makes here's New England. Dixie Bull makes his landing in Pemaquid. This is, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. This is Fort William Henry as it looks today, the reproduced fort. When Dixie Bull landed, it looked nothing like that. Certainly, the islands and the water probably looked like that. The fort did not look like that. There was, as I said, at that time, probably a wooden storehouse of some kind, maybe with a stockade fence, a few houses. There were only a couple hundred people living in Pemaquid at the time. It was one of the big settlements on the coast of Maine, but that ain't saying much in 1630. So Dixie Bull comes ashore. This is where he makes his big score, attacks the warehouse, loots it, loots all of the houses in the area, and makes off with, by some accounts, 500 pounds worth of goods, which is, frankly, a lot of money at the time. As Dixie Bull and his men and a couple of ships, they're weighing anchor, one of Abraham Chute's men fires at them with a musket. Lucky shot, drops one of Dixie Bull's men and kills him. This is the only casualty that really takes place on either side during Dixie Bull's raiding. By some accounts, Dixie and the other pirates were absolutely terrified by this. They're like really freaked out that somebody was shot. It says, fear seized, one of the accounts, local accounts says, fear seized on some of the less hardened. The crew was weakened by desertion, and the more desperate fled to the eastward. It's like, come on. You got to lose your pirate's card if you're that scared of one casualty. But they did manage to loot Pemaquid. They looted some other vessels. They certainly caused considerable panic in the region, as you can imagine. This is the first time anything like this had ever happened. Planters down in Piscataqua sent out 4 boats with 40 men to hunt Dixie down. Governor Winthrop added his ship to the fleet with 20 men on board to scour the coast to try to bring Dixie and his men to justice. It was actually the first armed fleet ever fitted out in New England, and it was fitted out to hunt down Dixie Bull. Never did find him, of course. Searched the coast up and down for weeks. At some point, Dixie Bull and his men captured a small vessel owned by a fellow named Anthony Dix. And Dix wrote a report about this and described what had happened. He said that Dixie Bull tried to force him to pilot their ships down to Virginia. They wanted to run to Virginia and escape there. As one pastor had referred to Virginia as a nest of rogues, whores, dissolute, and rooking persons. So what's not to like? It's perfect for a pirate. But Anthony Dix refused to pilot them. And again, he reports that Dixie Bull and his men were absolutely terrified. He wrote, they told Dix that they were filled with such fear and horror again that they were afraid of his very rattling of the ropes. So apparently, there are a number of accounts that suggest that these guys were really freaked out by what they did and were really afraid of getting caught. The men from Piscataqua and the governor's ship never caught Dixie Bull. Winter came on and they abandoned it. But next spring, the fear of Dixie Bull and his men was still present. They were still afraid that these guys were lurking somewhere on the coast of Maine. So in the spring of 1633, they once again sent out an expedition searching for Dixie Bull and his men and never found them. It's not at all clear where he went. There's another account from the time that wrote, a trader for beaver that is now turned pirate and hath done much spoil here in the country. His name is Bull. He is on of London. He took away from the plantation of Pemaquid as much good and provisions as is valued to be worth 500 pounds. So you see, they're still worried about this guy. They're still afraid that he's out there, but they never found him. And it's not at all clear what happened to him. There are a lot of rumors that he went down to the Caribbean, that he went over to the French, and of course, over the years of the centuries, there are all sorts of legends that have come up around Dixie Bull. There are far more legends about him than there are facts. And there's all sorts of folk songs and all sorts of great stories. But it does appear in 1648, in the records of the Company of Skinners, it says that Dixie Bull actually completed his apprenticeship. So it's possible that he got away with all of this and went back to London and just lived on as a peaceable skinner in the streets of London. So we don't really know much about him, but luckily we have him. He's our pirate, and we can at least enjoy our Dixie Bull. So thank you. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to make something up.
What was his real name?
Dixie Bull.
Dixie?
Dixie Bull, yeah. That was. I don't think it was necessarily that unusual a name at the time. It seems very odd now, but yeah, no, that was his name.
Great pirate name.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Do you have any record of the size and make of his boat?
No, not really. They're often described as shallops, which, as you know, a shallop is an open boat, but it's a really pretty loose term. So it can be anything from a 15, 20-foot boat to a 45-foot boat with a very elaborate rig on it. It's like the term pinnace, which you hear a lot. Virginia, the ship that we built down in Bath, is a pinnace. But again, that's a very loose term. So you have very small boats that are called that. You have very large boats that are called that. So we don't know, but probably, I would say, 45 feet, maybe partially decked over, maybe a sprit rig or something like that. But pretty simple, yeah.
That's what he would run back to England with?
Well, probably not. That's a little small. Probably he would have taken passage on a large vessel, paid for passage. Yeah. And undoubtedly that's how he came over. It's, the boats are very ambiguous, like I say, and it's very frustrating, particularly for maritime historians, because it's like nowadays, if you're writing about something, you'd say, well, he escaped in a car. Okay, well, we all know what a car is, but it doesn't give you much detail. It's the same thing with these accounts. They'll say, well, he went in his boats to the eastward. Well, okay, we want to know what kind of boats, but they don't care. That's not a detail they cared about, so, yeah.
Were there any other pirates that were tooling around this part of the country, and is there any legend about buried treasure?
Lots of legends about buried treasure, absolutely. There was most of the pirates that are associated with Maine really were kind of passing through. So, like for instance, Black Sam Bellamy, who was the captain of the pirate ship Widda, which wrecked off of Cape Cod. Some of you may have been familiar with this. They found the wreck. It's an unbelievable artifact. They're still pulling stuff up from it. But he was apparently on his way to Maine to hide out when his ship wrecked. and the ship that was with him did continue on to Maine. But they came here really just to hide out. You know, this is 1720, and there still isn't that much going on that's attractive to a pirate. There's, of course, legends that Captain Kidd came through here, but then Captain Kidd comes through everywhere. Captain Kidd is actually, that's an interesting, not to go on a completely different tangent, but it's interesting is Captain Kidd, William Kidd, is really kind of considered, you know, the notorious pirate. But he really wasn't a pirate in the same way that Dixie Bull wasn't a pirate. Captain Kidd started off with a commission to hunt pirates in the Red Sea. And it's only when he failed to catch any and his crew started getting mutinous that he started sort of turning to piracy. He was really kind of forced into it in the same way that Dixie Bull was really kind of forced into it, you know, just by circumstances. I don't think Dixie Bull ever wanted to rob anyone. He was, you know, he was a genuine businessman. He was just desperate. Same thing with Captain Kidd. So as far as buried treasure, Captain Kidd is one of the few pirates that we know who actually did bury treasure. You know, most of what we know about piracy was made up by Robert Louis Stevenson, including the buried treasure. But when Kidd returned to New York, he knew that he was going to be in some serious trouble. So he took some of his loot and he buried it along the way, kind of as an insurance policy. And it never was found. So that's why you have stories of Captain Kidd's buried treasure everywhere. But probably not in Maine. So.
Have you ever read the poem about Bristol's Daniel Curtis?
Yes, shoot. Yes, yeah. Well, there's one. That's the one about him, the death of Dixie Bull, where there's one poem that describes him challenging Dixie Bull to a duel and killing him. I believe. Is that the poem you're thinking of?
I don't know which one.
Okay. Yeah. And then there's all sorts of.
And Daniel Curtis is of the next century.
Oh, is he? Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, oops. Yes, is there a question?
I think that's the one that shows up in Ekstrom's Minstrelsy of Maine.
Okay.
It's Dixie Bull, the pirate bull.
Oh.
Goes through the whole business with Dan Curtis.
Okay, right. Yes, yeah. That's pretty silly, but that's typical of, you know, all of this mythology that's sprung up around Dixie Bull, you know, at least.
Didn't he supposedly buried treasure on John's Island and people been over there looking for it?
Probably.
History of that?
The Dixie Bull did?
Yeah.
I've not heard that, but it would not surprise me if that rumor is, but I don't, you know, these guys really didn't bury treasure. You know, they took it and spent it. So, yeah, but it wouldn't surprise me if that story is cropped up and people have been out there with shovels. Yeah.
You said he finished his apprenticeship?
Apparently, I mean,
Then he must have gone back to England.
it would seem that way. Yeah. I mean, you know,
So that was the last anybody heard of him, finishing.
yeah, that's the last record that we have of him. You know, the Royal Society of Skinners, in their records, says that a Dixie Bull completed his apprenticeship in 1648. You know, and it is, as you said, it's an unusual name. So it seems to be him. So yeah, he, you know, luckily in the days before computers, you could get away with a lot more. So, yes.
How long was a typical apprenticeship? That seems like a long time.
It does seem like a long time. And I don't know for sure, but I tend to think of apprenticeships as usually being like 4 to 6 years. I'm not sure what it is about being a skinner that took so long, but I'd always thought that coopers had the longest apprenticeship, which makes sense to me because it seems so bloody hard to make a barrel. But
He wasn't there all the time, he was over here.
that's true, yeah. Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
If he did return to England, I know it's all hypothetical, but would he have been wanted there like he was?
Certainly. Oh, yeah.
Massachusetts?
Yeah, no, he was wanted for piracy, and that was, you know, pretty universal. Certainly in any English governed area, he would have been a wanted man. Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Well, that's why, you know, Captain Kidd was from You know, he was tried in New York. Well, actually, he was tried in London. He came back to New York, and then they sent him to London to be tried because it's all the same. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. And I'm going to mosey back there if anyone wants a book. And